The heavy oak grandfather clock in the corner of the lawyer's office ticked with a slow, maddening rhythm. Every click felt like a heavy hammer striking the final nail into a coffin. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, a relentless, freezing gray rain washed over the city, blurring the towering skyscrapers into jagged, melancholic shadows. But inside this opulent, wood-paneled room, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. I sat perfectly still in a high-backed leather chair, my hands neatly folded in my lap, resting on the simple black fabric of my morning dress. I am 48 years old, and for the last 25 years, I had been the silent, obedient, and constantly humiliated wife of Arthur Pendleton. Arthur was a titan. He was a man who built a vast, multi-billion-dollar logistics and shipping empire from a single, rusty delivery truck. He possessed a mind like a steel trap and a gaze that could make grown men tremble. He was 58 when we married. I was a 23-year-old assistant working in his archiving department. Across the massive mahogany table sat his 2 children from his first marriage, Thomas and Evelyn. Thomas, a 50-year-old man who had never worked a hard day in his life, was casually leaning back in his chair, impatiently checking his absurdly expensive gold watch. Evelyn, 47, was aggressively chewing a piece of nicotine gum, her sharp, surgically enhanced features twisted into a permanent, condescending sneer. They weren't mourning their father, they were celebrating. For 25 long years, Thomas and Evelyn had treated me like a terminal disease. They called me the intern, the gold digger, the temporary lease. They made sure I was explicitly excluded from every family photograph, seated at the farthest, coldest ends of the table during holiday dinners, and openly mocked my working-class background. They tolerated my presence only because Arthur demanded it, but behind his back, their cruelty was absolute and relentless. And today, they smugly believed their long, agonizing wait was finally over. Arthur had passed away 4 days ago from a sudden, massive stroke. The Titan had finally fallen. And now, the spoils of his lifetime of labor were to be divided among his rightful heirs. "Can we speed this up, Mr. Harrison?" Thomas sighed heavily, rolling his eyes at the elderly, distinguished estate lawyer who was meticulously adjusting his reading glasses. "I have a first-class flight to Aspen at 4 o'clock. We all know how this standard procedure goes. Just read the part where my father leaves a generous, tax-deductible parting gift for his companion here, and let's get down to the actual estate distribution. I have a lot of changes to make at the company." Evelyn let out a sharp, cruel laugh. It was a sound I had heard 1,000 times before. It was the distinct sound of inherited money mocking someone they believed was infinitely beneath them. "Don't be unnecessarily rude, Thomas," Evelyn drawled, her voice dripping with artificial pity and real venom. "I'm sure Victoria will be very comfortable in whatever little condo Dad decided to lease for her. Maybe somewhere far out in the suburbs, or perhaps she can finally go back to her old, charming neighborhood. After all, she's had a free ride for 2 decades. It's time to clock out." I didn't blink. I didn't defend myself. I didn't let a single emotion cross my face. I just looked at them, my expression an unreadable mask of absolute calm. For 25 years, I had quietly swallowed their insults to keep the peace. I had ironed Arthur's shirts when his hands grew too arthritic. I had sat up with him at 3 a.m. when the immense stress of his empire gave him severe heart palpitations. I had loved him with a fierce, quiet, unwavering devotion that these 2 spoiled parasites couldn't even begin to comprehend. But Arthur knew. He knew exactly who his children truly were. And more importantly, he knew exactly what they would try to do to me the moment his heart stopped beating. Mr. Harrison cleared his throat, a deep, resonant sound that immediately commanded silence in the room. He didn't look at Thomas or Evelyn. He looked directly at me, his aged eyes holding a mixture of deep sorrow and profound, knowing respect. "Very well," Mr. Harrison said, his voice grave and completely devoid of warmth. We shall proceed directly to the final testament of Arthur James Pendleton. However, before I begin, I must explicitly inform you both that this will was updated, finalized, and sealed precisely 3 weeks ago. It legally supersedes all previous documents, trusts, and promises. Thomas frowned, his arrogant, relaxed posture stiffening slightly. 3 weeks ago? That's impossible. He was on heavy blood pressure medication 3 weeks ago. If there are any drastic last-minute changes, my legal team will contest this document before the ink is dry. You are more than welcome to try, Thomas, Mr. Harrison replied coldly, unfolding a thick, cream-colored document with a heavy wax seal. However, Arthur anticipated your reaction. He attached a certified medical evaluation from 3 independent court-approved neurologists, unanimously attesting to his absolute mental clarity and cognitive perfection. Shall I read? Thomas waved his hand dismissively, though the arrogant smirk had completely vanished from his face. Evelyn had stopped chewing her gum. Mr. Harrison began to read the standard legal jargon, the revocation of past wills, and the burial instructions, and then the temperature in the room seemed to plummet to absolute zero. To my son, Thomas, and my daughter, Evelyn, the lawyer read, his voice ringing out in the quiet room like a federal judge delivering a life sentence. You have spent your entire adult lives circling me like vultures, waiting for me to die. You have secretly siphoned millions from my company accounts. You have accumulated massive, shameful debts, and you have treated my wife, Victoria, with a level of unprovoked cruelty that disgusts me to my absolute core. Evelyn gasped loudly, her hand flying to her chest in shock. Thomas's face instantly drained of all blood, turning a sickly, pale white. You arrogantly believed Victoria was my weakness, the will continued, every word hitting them like a physical blow. You believed she was a foolish, naive girl waiting for a payout. What you did not know is that for the last 10 years, Victoria and I have been watching you. I know about the secret Cayman Island accounts, Thomas. I know about the 3 mortgaged mansions, Evelyn. And I knew that your creditors were preparing to destroy you both. The silence that followed was deafening. It was the terrifying sound of 2 arrogant, greedy lives imploding in real time. I did not want to see my children go to federal prison, nor did I want my family name dragged through bankruptcy court, Mr. Harrison read, his eyes fixed firmly on the paper. So, I paid them off. I bought your debts, Thomas. I bought your mortgages, Evelyn. I am your only creditor. Evelyn started to shake. Thomas gripped the edge of the mahogany table so hard his knuckles turned white. Therefore, Mr. Harrison read, delivering the final, fatal strike. I leave the entirety of my estate, my company, all liquid assets, and the absolute ownership of Thomas and Evelyn's debt portfolios, entirely to my beloved wife, Victoria. The lawyer carefully placed the heavy document on the table, removed his glasses, and folded his hands. Effective immediately, Mr. Harrison concluded softly, looking at the 2 utterly horrified faces across the table. She owns everything, including both of you. The ticking of the grandfather clock suddenly sounded like a victorious march. The arrogant laughter that had haunted me for 25 years was completely, irrevocably dead. And as Thomas began to hyperventilate, and Evelyn stared at me with wide, terrified eyes, I slowly uncrossed my hands, leaned forward, and prepared to deliver the very first lesson of their new, terrifying reality. The silence in the lawyer's office was so absolute that I could hear the erratic, panicked breathing of Thomas sitting across from me. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and was waiting to hit the ground. Evelyn was completely paralyzed, staring at the wax seal on her father's will as if it were a venomous snake. Seeing them break like this, seeing their 25 years of unearned arrogance vanish in 60 seconds, should have brought me a rush of pure, vindictive joy. But it didn't. Instead, my mind drifted away from the opulent office and the freezing rain. It drifted back a quarter of a century to a cramped, windowless room in the basement of Pendleton Logistics. 25 years ago, I wasn't draped in designer morning clothes. I was 23 years old, wearing a cheap, slightly frayed gray cardigan, and my hands were permanently stained with printer ink and the dust of old paper. I worked in the corporate archives. It was the lowest paying, most invisible job in Arthur's massive empire. While the executives clinked crystal glasses in the glass-walled penthouses above, I spent 12 hours a day cataloging shipping manifests, customs declarations, and old employee records. I was invisible, but I was also the only person who truly understood how the foundation of the empire was built. Thomas was 25 at the time. Arthur had just appointed him as the Vice President of Acquisitions, a title Thomas celebrated by immediately buying a bright red Ferrari with company funds and taking a 3-week networking trip to Monaco. Evelyn, who was 22, was technically on the payroll as a consultant, though she had never once stepped foot in the actual building. They viewed their father's company as a magical ATM that simply dispensed millions upon request. Arthur, however, viewed his company as his life's blood, and he knew exactly what his children were doing. It was a miserable, stormy Friday night in late November. The entire building had emptied out by 6 p.m. Everyone had gone to the local bars or home to their families. I was alone in the basement, sitting on the cold concrete floor surrounded by towers of cardboard boxes, trying to reconcile a massive discrepancy in a decade-old freight ledger. Suddenly, the heavy metal door to the archives swung open. I looked up, expecting the night watchman. Instead, Arthur Pendleton stood in the doorway. He was 58, a towering figure with silver hair, a custom-tailored navy suit, and a face carved from granite. He looked exhausted, carrying a weight that only a man at the top of the world can understand. He had come down personally to find a specific commercial contract from the 1980s because his highly paid executive team couldn't be bothered to stay late and find it themselves. "What are you still doing here?" His voice boomed, echoing off the concrete walls. It wasn't a friendly question. It was the sharp, suspicious demand of a CEO who expected to find a thief. I scrambled to my feet, wiping the dust off my cheap skirt. "I'm reconciling the 94 Atlantic freight ledgers, Mr. Pendleton," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "There's a systemic error in the weight declarations. It's been costing the company approximately $40,000 a year in unnecessary port fines. I almost have it fixed." Arthur stopped dead in his tracks. He slowly walked over, looking down at the messy piles of highlighted paper, the calculator, and my ink-stained fingers. He didn't say a word for a long time. His sharp, calculating eyes analyzed me, stripping away my youth and my cheap clothes, looking straight into my work ethic. "My vice president of acquisitions," Arthur said quietly, referencing his son Thomas, "told me yesterday that those fines were simply an unavoidable cost of doing global business. He said fixing it wasn't worth the manpower." "With all due respect, sir," I replied, finding a sudden spark of courage. "Your vice president doesn't know how to read a freight ledger. The money is bleeding from a very specific clerical error in Sector 4. I can have the corrected report on your desk by Monday morning." Arthur Pendleton didn't smile. But something fundamental shifted in his eyes. He didn't see a pretty 23-year-old girl. He saw a loyal soldier. He saw someone who respected the empire he had bled to build, while his own flesh and blood were busy tearing it down to buy sports cars. He didn't ask me out on a romantic date. Arthur was far too pragmatic for that. A week later, he called me up to the executive penthouse. He sat behind his massive desk, poured 2 glasses of scotch, and laid out a proposition that would change both of our lives forever. "I am surrounded by leeches, Victoria," he said, his voice heavy with a profound, terrifying loneliness. "I have built a kingdom, and I am watching my heirs sharpen their knives while I am still sitting on the throne. They are waiting for me to die. I need someone in my corner. I need someone who understands the value of a single dollar, the value of hard work, and the value of loyalty. I don't want a trophy. I want a partner. He offered me his name, his protection, and a life I could never have imagined. In exchange, he asked for absolute loyalty. He asked me to stand by his side and help him protect his legacy from the very children he had raised. When we announced our marriage, the fallout was apocalyptic. Thomas threw a crystal decanter against the wall of his father's office, screaming that Arthur had lost his mind. Evelyn wore a solid black mourning dress to our quiet, private wedding ceremony, openly weeping as if someone had died. "You're making a fool of yourself, Dad," Thomas had hissed at the reception, glaring at me with absolute disgust. "She's 23. She's a glorified secretary. She's going to drain you dry and leave you in a nursing home. You're a pathetic old man who fell for a cheap trick." Arthur didn't yell. He didn't defend me. He simply looked at his son with cold, terrifying pity. "We will see, Thomas," Arthur whispered softly. "We will see who drains who." And so began my 25-year silence. A silence I maintained not out of weakness, but out of a profound, unshakable respect for the man who saw my worth when I was sitting on a basement floor. They thought I was the parasite. But as I sit here now, looking at their horrified faces in the lawyer's office, I know that Arthur's final masterpiece is about to be revealed. The memory of the dusty basement faded, completely replaced by the harsh, immediate reality of Thomas's violent outburst. "This is absolute fraud!" Thomas roared, slamming his manicured fist so hard against the mahogany table that Mr. Harrison's coffee cup rattled in its saucer. The 50-year-old man, who had spent his entire life coasting on his father's reputation, was now red-faced, spitting with rage, and completely abandoning his polished, aristocratic facade. "She coerced him! Look at her! She's been plotting this since the day she crawled out of the mailroom. My father was nearly 83 years old. He wasn't in his right mind. I will tie this estate up in probate court for the next decade. I will bleed you dry in legal fees, Victoria, until you are begging to give me my rightful share." Evelyn, on the other hand, had taken a different route. The aggressive sneer was gone, replaced by sudden theatrical tears. She pulled a silk handkerchief from her designer purse, sobbing loudly. "How could you do this to us?" Evelyn wailed, pointing a trembling, diamond-ringed finger at me. "We are his blood. We are his actual family. You isolated him. You poisoned his mind against his own children just so you could steal everything he worked for. It's disgusting. It's elder abuse." I sat perfectly still, listening to the rain beat against the glass. I didn't break eye contact with either of them. Let them scream. Let them cry. It was exactly what Arthur had predicted they would do. He had spent 25 years warning me about this exact moment, and he had armed me with a weapon so precise, so legally devastating, that no high-priced lawyer in the country could dismantle it. Mr. Harrison did not flinch. The elderly lawyer simply adjusted his glasses, opened his heavy leather briefcase, and pulled out 2 thick black binders. He dropped them onto the table with a heavy, definitive thud that immediately silenced Evelyn's fake crying. "Sit down, Thomas, mister," Harrison commanded. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the chilling, unquestionable authority of the law. "Unless you want me to read the specific details of these files into the public record, I suggest you lower your voice and listen very carefully to how completely your father outplayed you." Thomas hesitated, his chest heaving, but the sight of those black binders seemed to trigger a primal fear in him. He slowly sank back into his chair, his eyes locked on the thick folders. Arthur Pendleton was the sharpest mind I have ever had the privilege of representing, Mr. Harrison began, resting his hands on the files. He did not suffer fools, and he certainly did not suffer thieves, even if they shared his DNA. For the last 10 years, both of you have operated under the arrogant assumption that your father was too old, too tired, or too blind to notice the massive holes you were burning in your own trust funds and the company's peripheral accounts. The lawyer opened the first binder. It had Thomas's name printed clearly on the tab. "Thomas," Mr. Harrison said, flipping through pages of bank statements and signed contracts. "3 years ago, you heavily leveraged your future inheritance to secure a $12 million commercial real estate loan in Dubai for a luxury resort project. A project that, according to these documents, was actually a sophisticated shell game that collapsed 6 months ago. Your creditors were preparing to seize your domestic assets, freeze your accounts, and potentially pursue federal wire fraud charges. You were 3 weeks away from total, unrecoverable ruin." Thomas looked like he was going to be physically sick. The color had completely drained from his face. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. "And Evelyn," Mr. Harrison continued, smoothly opening the second binder. "You have been living a lifestyle that costs approximately $4 million a year, funded almost entirely by high-yield shadow loans. You mortgaged your primary estate in the Hamptons 3 separate times. You have defaulted on 2 massive lines of credit. Your socialite status was hanging by a thread, funded by loan sharks who charge 20% interest." Evelyn wasn't crying anymore. She was staring at the table, her hands shaking violently. The horrific realization was finally setting in. "Your father knew," Mr. Harrison stated, his voice devoid of any sympathy. "He knew that if he simply handed you the keys to his empire, you would bankrupt the company and put thousands of hardworking employees out on the street to cover your own reckless, arrogant mistakes. He refused to let his life's work be destroyed by your incompetence." "So what did he do?" Thomas whispered, his voice cracking, sounding like a terrified child rather than a 50-year-old executive. "He paid them off. He cleared our debts." "He did not clear them," I spoke. It was the very first time I had spoken since walking into the office. My voice was quiet, incredibly calm, and completely steady. Both Thomas and Evelyn's heads snapped toward me as if I had just fired a gun. "Arthur didn't forgive your debts, Thomas," I said, looking directly into his terrified eyes. "He bought them. He used a private, anonymous holding company named Archive Holdings LLC, a little inside joke between us, to purchase every single one of your promissory notes, your mortgages, and your leveraged loans from your creditors. He paid full price to ensure they were legally transferred without a single loophole." I leaned forward slightly, resting my hands on the mahogany table, channeling the exact intimidating posture my husband had used in the boardroom for 50 years. "Arthur didn't leave you a fortune," I said softly, delivering the final crushing blow. "He left you your own financial ruin. And as the sole owner of Archive Holdings, your debts now belong exclusively to me. I am your bank, Thomas. I am your mortgage holder, Evelyn. Every house you live in, every car you drive, every credit card you swipe, I own it. And starting tomorrow morning, I am calling in the debts." The following Monday morning, the relentless freezing rain had finally stopped, leaving the city streets slick and washed clean. For 25 years, I had entered the colossal glass skyscraper of Pendleton Logistics through the private underground garage, keeping my head down, a silent shadow walking 2 steps behind my formidable husband. I had never once set foot on the executive floor without Arthur holding my hand. Today, I walked through the main glass revolving doors. I wasn't wearing the black morning dress anymore. I was wearing a sharp, impeccably tailored navy blue suit, the exact shade Arthur always wore to board meetings. Flanking me were 2 of Arthur's most trusted personal security guards and Mr. Harrison, carrying his heavy leather briefcase. The sprawling marble lobby fell completely silent the moment my heels clicked against the floor. The receptionist, who for decades had offered me only thin, patronizing smiles, instantly stood up, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and sheer panic. The whispers swept through the building faster than a wildfire. The mailroom girl, the gold digger, the temporary lease had just walked in as the sole owner of a multi-billion-dollar empire. I didn't stop to greet anyone. I stepped into the private executive elevator and pressed the button for the 52nd floor. The boardroom. When the polished steel door slid open, I could hear Thomas's voice echoing down the hallway. He was shouting. He had called an emergency meeting of the board of directors at 8 in the morning, desperately trying to rally Arthur's old executives to his side before I could officially take control. "We have to freeze the corporate accounts immediately," Thomas was yelling, slamming his hand on the massive glass conference table as I approached the open double doors. He looked entirely unhinged. His tie was loose, he hadn't shaved, and he was sweating profusely. "She manipulated a dying man. The legal team is filing an injunction as we speak. If we let this waitress touch the company's infrastructure, she'll bankrupt us in a week." The 12 men and women sitting around the table, veteran executives who had built this company alongside Arthur, looked profoundly uncomfortable. They respected Arthur deeply, and they knew perfectly well how incompetent his son was. I stepped into the doorway. The room instantly froze. "Security!" Thomas barked, his voice cracking slightly as he pointed a shaking finger at me. "Remove this woman from the premises immediately. She has no clearance to be on this floor." The two massive security guards standing behind me didn't move a muscle. They just stared at Thomas with blank, unforgiving expressions. They didn't take orders from the vice president of acquisitions anymore. I walked slowly into the room, my gaze fixed entirely on Thomas. The silence was so thick it felt heavy. I walked past the seated executives, who instinctively sat up straighter, and I stopped at the head of the table. Arthur's chair, the massive, high-backed leather seat that had remained empty since his passing. I didn't ask for permission. I pulled it out and sat down. "Good morning, gentlemen, ladies," I said, my voice calm, modulated, and echoing the precise cadence my husband used to calm a panicked room. "I apologize for the dramatic nature of this transition. However, I want to assure you all that Pendleton Logistics is fully secure. There will be no freezes, no massive layoffs, and no restructuring of your departments. Arthur left a very detailed succession plan, and we are going to follow it to the letter." I turned my head slowly to look at Thomas, who was standing paralyzed at the opposite end of the table. "Starting with the immediate termination of the vice president of acquisitions," I said softly. Thomas's face flushed a deep, dangerous crimson. "You can't fire me. I am a Pendleton. I am a board member. I own shares in this company." "You own nothing, Thomas," Mr. Harrison interjected coldly, stepping forward and opening his black briefcase. He slid a thick stack of legal documents across the long glass table. They stopped perfectly in front of Thomas. "As per the stipulations of the loans your father purchased, your personal shares in Pendleton Logistics were used as collateral for your Dubai resort project. You defaulted on that loan 6 months ago. The shares now belong to Archive Holdings, LLC, which means they belong to Victoria." I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the cool glass. "For 25 years, Thomas, I watched you treat this company like your personal playground," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that commanded the absolute attention of every executive in the room. "You mocked me for working in the basement archives. You called me a glorified secretary. But while you were taking company jets to Monaco and expensing $1,000 dinners, I was finding the clerical errors in the freight ledgers that you were too lazy to read. I know the lifeblood of this empire. You only know how to spend it." Thomas was visibly shaking now. The arrogant prince had been completely stripped of his armor in front of the entire kingdom. "You have 30 days, Thomas," I continued, my eyes locked onto his. 30 days to repay the $12 million you owe me for your failed real estate venture. If the funds are not in my account by the deadline, my legal team will seize your penthouse, your offshore accounts, and every single asset tied to your name. You will be completely bankrupt." "You're a monster," he whispered, his voice trembling with a terrifying mixture of hatred and absolute despair. "My father would never have wanted this." "Your father orchestrated this," I corrected him sharply, my voice slicing through his delusion. "He built a cage to contain your greed, and he handed me the key. Now, place your corporate credit cards and the keys to the company Ferrari on the table, and have security escort you out of my building." Thomas looked around the room, desperate for someone, anyone to jump to his defense, but the executives just looked down at their notepads. They knew it was over. With shaking hands, Thomas reached into his tailored pocket, pulled out the gold corporate cards and a heavy set of car keys, and dropped them onto the glass table. They landed with a pathetic, hollow clatter. He didn't say another word. He turned around and walked out of the boardroom, flanked by the 2 security guards, his shoulders slumped in total defeat. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the ghost of Arthur's presence standing right behind my chair. I looked at the stunned executives, offered them a small professional nod, and opened the first folder on the table. "Now," I said, my voice steady and resolute. "Let's get back to work." By Thursday evening, the storm had returned, wrapping the sprawling 50-acre Pendleton estate in a thick, chilling fog. I was sitting in Arthur's private study, a massive room lined from floor to ceiling with first edition books and the scent of aged leather and expensive scotch. The fire was crackling in the massive stone hearth, casting long, dancing shadows across the room. I was meticulously reviewing the ledgers of Archive Holdings LLC, tracing exactly how deep Evelyn's financial grave truly was, when the heavy oak doors to the study creaked open. Maria, the estate's loyal housekeeper who had silently watched the children abuse me for 2 decades, stepped inside. There was a rare, grim satisfaction in her eyes. "Ma'am," Maria said softly, a title she now used with profound, genuine respect. "Evelyn is at the front door. She bypassed the security gate. She is very distressed. Should I call the guards?" I closed the thick leather binder and folded my hands on the desk. "No, Maria. Let her in. But remain in the hallway, please." A moment later, Evelyn stumbled into the study. The transformation was staggering. The arrogant, surgically perfected socialite who had chewed nicotine gum and sneered at me in the lawyer's office was completely gone. Her expensive designer trench coat was soaked from the rain. Her makeup was smeared under her eyes, and she was physically trembling, clutching a soaking wet Hermes handbag like a life preserver. She looked around the opulent study, her eyes frantically darting to the empty leather chair I was sitting in. The reality of the power dynamic hit her all over again. "Victoria!" Evelyn choked out, her voice a desperate, high-pitched whine. She didn't call me the intern or the mailroom girl. She used my actual name. "Victoria, please. You have to help me. They're calling me. The shadow lenders. The men Dad bought the loans from. They said my accounts are frozen. My black cards are declining. I couldn't even pay my driver to get here." I didn't offer her a seat. I didn't offer her a towel. I just watched her, my face a mask of absolute, terrifying calm. "The accounts are frozen because you have exhausted your collateral, Evelyn," I replied, my voice perfectly measured, echoing the steady crackle of the fireplace. "You owe Archive Holdings, which means you owe me, just over $16 million. The interest alone on the shadow loans you took to fund your shopping trips in Milan is compounding daily. You are not just broke, Evelyn. You are deeply, dangerously in the red." Evelyn practically collapsed into one of the leather guest chairs, burying her face in her hands. She began to sob, loud, theatrical, desperate tears. "It's not fair," she wailed, looking up at me with mascara-stained cheeks. "Dad was a billionaire. He had enough to pay it off 100 times over. Why did he give it to you? We are family. We are his blood. You know I don't know how to manage money. I've never had to. Please, Victoria, just give me an advance. Just $3 million to clear the aggressive lenders, and I promise I'll never bother you again." For 25 years, I had listened to this woman tell her high society friends that I was a parasite who had infected her noble bloodline. I had listened to her mock my cheap clothes, my modest upbringing, and my quiet demeanor. I stood up slowly, walked around the massive mahogany desk, and leaned against the edge, looking down at the crying 47-year-old child. "Do you remember my 25th birthday, Evelyn?" I asked softly. Evelyn stopped crying, blinking up at me in confused terror. Arthur hosted a small dinner, I continued, my voice cold and precise. You brought me a gift. It was a beautifully wrapped box, and inside was a cheap plastic mop and a bucket. You smiled at me in front of all of Arthur's executives and said it was to help me remember my roots because I would always just be the hired help. Evelyn gasped, her face turning a sickly shade of white. Victoria, I was young. I was joking. You weren't young, Evelyn. You were 24. And you weren't joking. I cut her off, my voice slicing through the room like a scalpel. You spent your entire life believing that the money in your bank account made you superior to everyone who actually worked for a living. You thought Arthur's wealth was a shield that protected you from consequence. But Arthur didn't build this empire by handing out free rides. And neither will I. I walked back behind the desk and opened her financial binder. I am not giving you $3 million, I stated flatly. In fact, I am not giving you another dime. Starting tomorrow morning, I am legally foreclosing on your Hamptons estate, the Manhattan penthouse, and liquidating the 3 sports cars sitting in your garages. They belong to me now, and I am selling them to recover a fraction of the debt you owe. Evelyn grabbed the edge of the desk, her eyes wide with absolute, unadulterated horror. You can't do that. Where will I live? How will I survive? I don't know how to do anything. You are going to learn, I replied, closing the binder with a sharp snap. I have secured a modest 2-bedroom apartment for you in the suburbs. The rent is paid for exactly 6 months. You will be provided a strict allowance of $2,000 a month for groceries and basic utilities. There are no credit cards. There are no drivers. If you want more money, you will do exactly what the hired help does. I leaned forward, locking my eyes with hers, delivering the final, crushing verdict. You will get a job, Evelyn. You will learn the value of a single dollar, just like your father wanted. And if you attempt to contact the press or drag this family's name through the mud, I will cut off the apartment and the allowance, and I will let the shadow lenders collect the rest of your debt however they see fit. Evelyn stared at me, her mouth opening and closing silently like a suffocating fish. The reality of her new life, the life she had mocked me for, was finally crashing down on her. The billionaire princess was dead. Now, I whispered, gesturing toward the heavy oak doors. You are dripping on my husband's antique rug. Please leave. As Evelyn slowly stood up, completely broken and sobbing quietly, I watched her walk out into the cold, unforgiving night. Arthur's final lesson was complete. He hadn't just protected me, he had forced his children to face the one thing they feared more than anything else in the world: reality. The heavy oak doors clicked shut, leaving me completely alone in the sprawling, silent study. The fire in the hearth had burned down to glowing red embers, casting a warm, steady light across the room. For the first time since Arthur's death, the sheer, crushing weight of my new reality began to settle over my shoulders. I had done it. I had executed his final plan flawlessly. Thomas was ruined, stripped of his unearned power. Evelyn was exiled, forced to face the real world for the very first time in her 47 years. The empire was secure, the vultures had been permanently caged. But as I sat in his massive leather chair, surrounded by the silence of the empty mansion, I didn't feel like an empress. I just felt like a widow who missed her husband. I stood up slowly and walked over to the towering mahogany bookshelf on the far wall. Behind a row of leather-bound encyclopedias, there was a small biometric wall safe. It wasn't for company documents or offshore accounts. It was Arthur's private vault. He had programmed my fingerprint into it on the day of our wedding 25 years ago. I pressed my thumb against the cool glass scanner. The heavy steel door clicked open with a soft hiss. Inside, there were no gold bars or stacks of cash. There was only a single, simple white envelope resting on top of a small velvet box. My name, Victoria, was written across the front in Arthur's distinct, sharp handwriting. The ink was slightly faded, telling me this letter hadn't been written in his final days. It had been waiting here for a long time. My hands trembled slightly as I broke the seal and unfolded the thick parchment. "My dearest Victoria," the letter began, "if you are reading this, the storm has finally broken, and my time is over. I know exactly what you are facing right now. I know the viciousness of my children, the whispers of the board members, and the exhausting burden of the empire I have left on your shoulders." I felt a hot tear slide down my cheek, blurring the ink on the page. I could almost hear his deep, commanding voice speaking the words. "For 25 years, I have watched you endure the cruelty of a world that refused to understand us. I watched you sit in silence while my son called you a parasite. I watched you swallow your pride when my daughter treated you like dirt. You never complained. You never demanded that I defend your honor in public. You simply stood by my side, held my hand when my heart failed, and proved your loyalty every single day." I had to stop reading for a moment, pressing my hand against my mouth to stifle a sob. The armor I had worn in the boardroom and in this study finally cracked. The world looked at us and saw a cliché. The letter continued. They saw an aging billionaire clinging to his youth and a beautiful young girl looking for a shortcut. They were fools. The truth, Victoria, is that before I walked into that basement archive 25 years ago, I was completely, terrifyingly alone. I was surrounded by sycophants who only saw me as a bank. My own children were waiting for me to die. You didn't need me to save you, Victoria. You were brilliant, fiercely independent, and you would have conquered the world on your own. It was you who saved me. You gave me 25 years of genuine peace. You gave me a home." I reached into the safe and pulled out the small velvet box. Inside, resting on a bed of white satin, was a simple, perfectly polished silver pocket watch. It wasn't covered in diamonds. It wasn't a priceless artifact. It was the very first gift I had ever given him, bought with my meager archivist salary for his 60th birthday. The back was engraved with 3 simple words: "Time is ours." I built the trap for Thomas and Evelyn not out of malice, but out of necessity. The final paragraph read, "I knew they would try to destroy you the moment I was gone. I had to ensure that you would never, ever have to bow to them. The company is yours. The wealth is yours. But most importantly, the power is yours. You are the sole architect of your future now. Do not mourn me for too long, my love. Rule the empire. Live your life. And never let anyone make you feel invisible again. Forever yours, Arthur." I pressed the letter against my chest, closing my eyes as the tears flowed freely. The immense, suffocating grief that I had held back for the sake of the company finally washed over me. I wept for the man who had seen my true worth. I wept for the 25 years of quiet, unbreakable love we had shared behind closed doors. They had called me a gold digger. They had called him a fool. But sitting in his chair, holding the silver pocket watch, I knew the absolute truth. I was the richest woman in the world, not because of the billions in the bank, but because for a quarter of a century I had been truly, deeply loved by a titan. I carefully folded the heavy parchment, placing Arthur's final letter back into the white envelope. My hands had stopped trembling. The crushing weight of grief that had momentarily brought me to my knees in the quiet study had passed, replaced by a profound, unbreakable sense of purpose. I picked up the simple silver pocket watch from its velvet bed. It was still ticking. A quiet, rhythmic heartbeat in the silent mansion. I slipped it into the tailored pocket of my navy blue suit, feeling the cool metal against my side. It was a promise. Time is ours. I walked over to the massive, floor-to-ceiling windows of the study. The thick fog that had choked the Pendleton estate all evening was finally beginning to lift. Far in the distance, past the manicured lawns and the heavy iron security gates, the sprawling skyline of the city glittered against the night sky. Somewhere out there in that glittering maze, Thomas was frantically dialing the numbers of fair-weather friends and offshore bankers who were no longer answering his calls. He was a 50-year-old man waking up to a world where his last name could no longer buy his way out of his own incompetence. Somewhere else, Evelyn was sitting in a modest two-bedroom apartment, staring blankly at a grocery budget, realizing for the first time in her life that electricity and heat actually cost money. The shadow lenders were off her back, but the suffocating reality of a normal working-class life was closing in on her. They had spent 25 years treating me like a temporary inconvenience. They had laughed at me, isolated me, and waited for the day they could throw me back into the gutter. They thought they were playing a game of inheritance. They didn't realize that Arthur and I were playing a game of survival. And we had just called checkmate. Tomorrow morning, my alarm will go off at 5 a.m. I won't be making Arthur his black coffee or helping him tie his silk cravat. I will get into the back of the armored town car alone. I will walk through the glass doors of Pendleton Logistics, take the private elevator to the 52nd floor, and sit at the head of the mahogany table. There will be whispers, of course. There always are. The media will call it a scandal. The high society wives will gossip over their mimosas, calling me the ultimate gold digger who pulled off the heist of the century. Let them whisper, let them write their articles. I know the truth. I know the value of the empire I helped protect, and I know the profound, quiet love of the titan who built it. I am no longer the 23-year-old girl terrified of her own shadow in the basement archives. I am 48 years old. I hold the absolute controlling interest in a global monopoly. I hold the debts of the people who tried to destroy me. And most importantly, I hold the unbreakable legacy of Arthur Pendleton. I take one last look at the city lights, take a deep, steadying breath, and turn away from the window. The silence in the mansion is no longer heavy or lonely. It is triumphant. The 25-year wait is officially over. The Queen has finally taken the board.